Come and join me as we dive into the world of careers, uncovering the reality behind the job titles you've always wondered about and how you can chart your path to success. Whether you're starting out or dreaming of a new role, I'm here to guide you. Real talk, real jobs, real insight, providing career clarity one conversation at a time. Welcome to Work Uncovered. Hi, I'm Terry Homans, career consultant and founder of Curated Careers. In today's episode, my guest, Dr. Tony Matthews, is going to be taking us into the field of urban and environmental planning. Tony is an urban planner, scholar, and international advocate for good cities. His award-winning work addresses current and emerging urban challenges through research, engagement, and practice. Dr. Matthews has a passion for translating insights into understandable and actionable terms with benefits for policymakers, professionals, and communities. His publications and research are translated into multiple languages and continue to inform and shape policy and practice in many countries. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Terry. Delighted to be along.
Fantastic. Great to have you. I'm going to dive straight in here and set some context. Can you tell us what exactly is urban and environmental planning?
Sure, happy to start there. I mean, urban planning, very simply, is just planning cities and planning spaces within cities so that they function in some way, so that they're somehow organized with a view to being coherent and facilitating economy and society. That's the very basic of urban planning. Environmental planning is really the parts of urban planning where you are crossing over with the natural environment somehow. And that could be anything from street tree planting, for example, to developing like high quality, internationally significant public spaces. Or if you're, for example, like a city like Canberra, for example, which has an integration of a lot of natural area and a lot of bushland and things like that. So any and all of that up to and including coastal zone management, climate change, adaptation, disaster resilience, emergency management. So any part of cities or city planning that comes up against environmental forces is where you will sort of find me and find that intersection between the two things. You might find the more straight up urban planners are kind of more focused on things like, where housing is going to go, for example, and the carriage capacity of local roads and getting sufficient public transport volume and things like that. Whereas environmental planners are looking at some of the other questions around like the land that's being cleared and the ecosystem services and the values that are being gained or lost, and so forth. So yeah, it's quite an intricate and a meshed field, but I've managed to tread that thin line between both for a long time.
I was just about to say, so it's a small field, not much to know. Wow,
Yeah,
that's a lot.
it
That's a
really
lot.
depends on what you do with it. It depends on what you do with it.
Before we get into your tale as such, can you tell us what are the typical pathways into these fields?
Basically, there's not a specific pathway through high school. It helps if you've done something that is what we would see to be kind of relevant to planning or the field of planning practice, which is something like geography or even economics, or if you've done kind of like a module of social studies or something like that. All of those things are relevant. And anything around logistics, and if you're familiar with, GIS or digital mapping, anything like that can help get you in. But for most students who are coming to us through the undergraduate pathway, which is the most common pathway in Australia, more common, I would say, in other parts of the world to approach planning via a postgraduate professional master's, which is what I did over in Ireland once upon a time. But in Australia, it's more normal to come through a university undergraduate degree in urban planning or urban and environmental planning, like we have at Griffith here. And you do usually 4 years, although there are some moves afoot within the broader industry to maybe see if that could be reduced to 3 years. Um, the thing about all of this is that when you do a planning degree in an Australian university, odds are it's going to be accredited by the Planning Institute of Australia, and that then gives it a lot of professional carriage for when you go job seeking and so on. So you've come through a registered, recognized, and assessed course that has met criteria set by the professional association. So most of the universities, if not all of them, will have that. And that's really the pathway into a university planning course that is accredited by the Planning Institute and then out the other side and into a job. It's not that complicated, honestly, at in Australia, and certainly not right now.
Excellent. Okay, so is that you mentioned that you did something slightly different in Ireland, but looking back to where you started your career, was this something you went into straight away, or did you do something else beforehand? Did you have earlier jobs in your career before deciding on this path? And if so, what were they?
I Yeah, I did actually. I did have some so the basically I was in university. I was doing a combination of economics and sociology. And honestly, without any great sort of vision to where it was going. It was easier back then to be like that. It's a bit more focused nowadays. So I went through 3 years of that, and then I went to do a master's in sociology for a year. And when I was doing that, I became very focused on understanding like cultural groups and cultural forces, and how societies organize themselves through groups and through certain cultural touch points and things like that. Um, which set me to understanding a lot of the world that we live in as a function of that, if you like. So I left that and went to do, I guess, the equivalent of like TAFE teaching here in Australia. I did a couple of years kicking around the further education sector in Ireland, teaching some modules and subjects around what I had done myself. But it was prescriptive teaching. We were teaching to modules. There wasn't a great deal of scope to. I mean, you could bring some of your own material or perspectives or whatever to bear, but it was you were teaching a course. Um, and so I wasn't finding it very fulfilling in a long-term sense. And I was playing around a little bit with property development as well on the side. This was at the height of the Irish Celtic Tiger, when everybody was thought it would go up forever. Um, and So while I was doing this for a few years, I just kind of thought, this isn't really like, this is okay, as in like, again, 20 or 25 years ago, when you were in your early 20s, there was nowhere near the same urgency around things like getting housing and stuff. It just wasn't as big of a concern. So you had more time to kind of luxuriate, if you like. So I took a few years to do that, working at a kind of a lowish level and not really fulfilling any great role in the world, I felt. And so I started to think, well, what can I do that's important and emergent and ongoing, where there's a need for new things to be learned and understood and applied. And so I thought, you know what, I'm quite interested in cities. I really always have been. And then I also thought, I've also always been quite interested in the natural environment. Um, and so maybe there's something between those two things. And, this was back at the height of the kind of sustainability boom. So I was like, well, it seems like cities and environment and climate change and that side is the way to go. And that interests me. And the way that development approvals and things like that go in Ireland and England and in many parts of Europe, they are way more forensic. So planners in Ireland are not a popular group, and all they're seen to do is just assess low-level development and say yes or no. But the reality of the profession, and what I didn't understand initially, and maybe for a while, is that planning is a much broader thing. It's like it's way more strategic and way more broad scale, and it looks at all of the conditioning factors that are and will shape cities and spaces over different timescales. And so it is an extraordinarily strategic profession and set of processes. So, like, it's no joke. Planning is planning at large and small scales. And a lot of it is about reverse engineering big visions down to the street level. Once I kind of realized there's much more to this, I thought I can really do this. I think I can do this. And it pulls in a lot of perspectives from things like economics and sociology and other things that I was already familiar with. And so I thought maybe I should do this. And just as luck would have it, a 2-year postgraduate master's course in planning and sustainable development opened at the local university when I was sort of in the midst of thinking about this. And so I allowed the first year to play out because I was still working. And I went and met with the course director, and I met with one or two students who were already in the course. And um, it sounded good to me. It sounded good to me. It sounded like a good opportunity to learn the things I wanted to learn, and then to get me accredited, in this case with the Royal Town Planning Institute, which is like the granddaddy of all of them in London, um, and also the Irish Planning Institute. So I thought, you know what, with that, I can also travel. I don't have to work in Ireland. I can work in the UK, I can work in Australia or Canada or wherever, because it's reciprocal recognition of a lot of this stuff for planners internationally. It's much easier than some other professions.
Okay.
So
That's
yeah, that was
good
it.
to
I
know.
did the 2-year master's. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to ask something?
No, I just said that's interesting to know because a lot of the times you might get a qualification in one country, but you can't actually then use it in another country.
It's a little bit more sympathetic in the planning world.
Yep.
As I say, you see, one of the differences that we have, and again, this is not commonly understood, is we're not signing off on things that could be life or death. Like, so an architect has to be pretty confident the building's going to stand up, a structural engineer likewise, and whereas planners are not involved in that. So we make plans and we come up with visions and policies and programs for achieving these things, and but we don't make decisions that endanger life and death, and so therefore we do not have to be professionally accredited in quite the same way. Um, and the principles of town planning are international and well established. So it makes it much easier from that regard. So you'll find a lot of Australian planners can go easily to the UK, for example, and many do. So yeah, I applied for the program. It was very competitive and very expensive. And while I was there, I met a professor from Australia who was much more in tune with what I was thinking about than the people who were teaching this course were. And I mean, it was a bit of a disappointment for me to arrive into this course and find that the kind of whole sustainability thing in the title of the course was mostly put there, it seemed to me at least, to attract students rather than actually expose them to content. So I was a bit frustrated by that, and I felt that that was a shortcoming there for me, and I wasn't getting some of the material I needed. I ran into a professor from Australia that was on sabbatical in Ireland at the time, and he gave a lecture to our planning program about climate change adaptation in southeast Queensland and what was happening at the time. And again, this was nearly 20 years ago. So that was like the the world leading stuff. And I was very impressed by him and very impressed by what he was onto and what his group were doing in southeast Queensland. And one thing led to another. I kept up with him by email afterwards. I did a master's thesis, like a research thesis that was really the first time that anyone actually practically engaged with the question of how planning took on climate change adaptation as a function rather than should it do it or is it theoretically aligned. And my master's thesis went on then to become like an extremely important international set of publications, which are like have incredible citation levels now for a planning research because, again, I just happened to be the first one to say a lot of this stuff and to be willing to say that I thought this was probably how it was going to go. And so I was right. But even at the time, the first person to say something that turns into a trend always gets cited anyway. So it turned out that this like bit of research that I was doing in my kitchen back in Ireland in 2008 or nine, would become a really significant piece of international knowledge in my field. And I kept up with the professor from out here, and one thing led to another. And I came out of that program and he said, listen, we've got a really big research project here. We're just a partner in it. It's led by a partnership between the federal government here in Australia and the state government. And he said it's all about climate change adaptation in Southeast Queensland. It's a multi-sector project, multi-agency project, millions and millions and millions of dollars, coordinated by the CSIRO. And we're one of the partner universities, and we're handling the planning, urban planning, and climate change adaptation side of it, which is really where you're at. And why don't you come out and join us and do a PhD with us? I mean, it was a fantastic opportunity, but it was also a huge move. And I really had to kind of run the numbers on it. Like it was a sort of a pole vault approach to my career. It was like move to Australia, spend a couple of years doing a PhD with the world's best thinkers who I don't know, see if you can swim enough to stay up with them, and then get a job out of it at the other side
Well, clearly
in
it
an
worked
industry
out.
that doesn't yet exist. Yeah, no, it worked out great. But it was a bit of a gamble. This was right around the time that the GFC was really starting to bite as well. So there wasn't a great deal of opportunity in the industry. Planning collapsed when the GFC hit because development collapsed.
Mhm.
Um,
That's a,
so
I'm really liking the tell
yeah,
though, because it's showing what a great scope there is to this field that you're in.
I'm only 20 years into this really. And when I do look at the things that I have been fortunate enough and lucky enough to be part of, over that time, like it's mind blowing, really, because once upon a time, I remember sitting in a classroom and them telling us, like, if you ever get to work on one of these things, it's like the super peak of planning. And I've worked on all of those things all over the world multiple times, and I'm still going. And like now we're doing an Olympics in Brisbane, which like is the peak because again, how many planners ever get to do an Olympics? Because you either have to be in a city that's got
That's
you know
hosting it.
the ability to host one, or you've got to be good enough that they're going to hire you from overseas or whatever the case is. But I mean, I've been inputting into the Brisbane Olympics since 2021, so 5 years now. And again, it's like these are extraordinary opportunities. I've been over to Indonesia, out to Nusantara, their capital city, which we were guiding them in master planning.
Wow.
I think I may well have been the first Westerner ever out there. I'm not sure. I mean, I think I may have been. Things like that. It's nuts. Like a whole city emerging from the jungle where there was nothing before, modeled on Canberra, not to look like Canberra, but modeled to have similar principles. And it's like, again, a master plan capital city is like something straight out of imagination. There's only a few of them. Like Washington D.C. is one, and there's a couple of others. So like to be involved in something like that where you're literally walking around site with mud on your boots, like it's been an extraordinary journey. I'm not going to lie about that side of it, and I'm very fortunate. Um, and this is kind of what I was saying earlier: is it's like there are a lot of opportunities out there, sometimes more even than people have time for, maybe.
No, I love all this because one of my, you've answered a whole plethora of things there, because one of the first questions I generally ask is, what are the major misconceptions about this field or this role? And you've ticked off quite a few there for certain. I will come back to that, but I want to backtrack first to just looking back to when you started and then those earlier roles you had in higher ed, etc. What early skills that you were developing then would you say were really valuable to you moving forward? Now, you have touched on it, but I want to state the obvious in case anybody's missed it.
Look, I mean, my number one skill always has been and still is, and the thing that carries me through the most, really, like the tires on the car really are like just communication skills. I'm good at explaining things to people. I'm good at communicating with people, and I'm nice to people.
Mhm.
And it all helps. And I figured out early on that I was good at explaining complicated things to audiences that weren't used to thinking about complicated things necessarily. I always just adopted that principle going forward. It's like if I can't explain the relevance of what I'm doing very quickly and simply to somebody, um, then it's not really as relevant as I think it is. But again, I was able to get complicated ideas down on paper also, as well as get them into the scientific journals. So that was it, really. That's the skill, and it still remains for any class of employment. Quite honestly, the number one skill: like, can you communicate with your coworkers? Can you express an idea or conceptualize clearly? Can you write clearly? Are you able to just communicate what's going on and why it's going on?
Absolutely. I think, and I think I even said this in my last interview, that has been the one skill that every single guest has mentioned when I say, what's the most important skill? That's the top one
Well, I'm
everybody says.
This is
And
one of
it's
those
definitely
times I'm
a
glad to
theme.
be running with the crowd. It's one of those times I'm glad to be running with the crowd for sure. Yeah, yeah, but that's true, and it keeps coming back. Professional surveys, and it's just it keeps coming back in every industry all the time.
Excellent. Let's look at, obviously, because you are in education as well, but then from your own side of things, what tends to draw people to urban planning? Because I know just in the conversations I have, I think people have a vague idea of what it is, and that's the whole point of the podcast, is to actually explain what it really is, not what we think it might be. So then what tends to draw people to urban planning? And then any of those misconceptions that you talked about, do they then come up and tend to surprise people and they go, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be?
Planning is not an enormous industry in Australia. There's a couple of thousand of us around the place. I often hear from students like, "Oh yeah, my aunt or uncle is a planner, or my parents' friend is a planner," and so they sort of talk me into thinking about it, or that sort of direct introduction.
Typical career
Um,
intro.
yeah, yeah, it's it's not as well transmitted through the secondary education system and career counseling system as it might be, for a couple of reasons, and I'm not trying to bash them for this.
Mhm.
Um, I think a lot of career counselors don't point to it because they themselves don't realize the potential of the industry. And when I say potential, I mean the potential to offer people an opportunity to do a lot of different things, right?
Mhm.
And also the potential to have a reliable salary that is substantively AI proof, and where you're in more demand than you would be in most other industries. And I was just talking to a principal planner yesterday who's an old student of mine, and still a professional friend in contact, and they're having a hard time getting anybody because there are far more jobs than people. And it's not a question of being able to offer big salaries. They're willing to pay big salaries. They just can't get the people.
When you said you're small in group, the profession in numbers in this country, is that because people just aren't moving into it, or because we don't yet have the need to have a bigger group of professionals?
Well, we've always had a need for more, for the majority of the time that I've been here, and in fact, I would say for the majority of the time since the turn of the century, we have been short-staffed or undersupplied for planners, and it has been on the government skilled occupation list for migrants more out of, for a longer period within that time frame than it's been off of
It's
it.
not.
They're always tracking, behind what they want and the numbers that they need. And so it is a problem. But I would say that's also a problem in pretty much most of the built environment professions. We certainly don't have enough quantity surveyors or civil engineers, probably either. Architects are plentiful, but experienced ones are harder to find. We definitely don't have enough tradies of pretty much every description, for example. So the whole development industry pipeline of people is under strain, but in planning has been for a long time. So there's not enough students going into planning courses within the country, and therefore there's not as many graduates coming out. And of course, all the ones that go in don't necessarily come out. All courses have a dropout rate. So if 100 start, maybe 80 finish. But maybe you want 120 in total. So you're still, yeah. So that's the problem right there.
Yeah, so that probably takes me back to that question then is, in being in that education space, do you even get to see what it is that drew people in? But is there anything that they find in your experience that you see that's a bit of a pattern where people coming with an idea or perception of what it might be, and then when they start getting into it, even at the university phase or just in the very first few years, discover that it's not what drew them in the first place, and therefore, for better or worse, it could be something they go, it wasn't what I expected, but I still love it, or this is not what I thought it was because I thought it was A and it is in fact B or C.
Yeah. The ones who are intentioned and sort of like have done their due diligence before they come in, know what they're getting into. Maybe they did high school geography, for example, so they got a taste of some planning projects. Um, they're usually not, they know what they're getting into and they're fine. I would say that what more tends to happen, and again, this is just in my experience, so I'm not saying that this is the broad trend line everywhere, and I particularly see that this in our university where we have a large architecture program as well. We do see students coming into architecture that probably should have come into planning and really wanted to do planning, but didn't understand that planning was the course they should have chosen. We get a lot of that. And so personally, I try and intercept that at our Gold Coast campus, especially on open day, because a lot of students come wanting to do architecture. Um, or maybe I want to do planning. I don't know, but I think I want to do architecture. Okay, well, tell me like what you'd like to be working on. I want to be working with people, and I'm very interested in play spaces for children, or very interested in sports infrastructure, and very interested in Cross River Rail project or whatever. Really, that sounds much more like planning. If you're interested in designing a building and that's all, then that's architecture. But if you're interested in space and a larger set of features and processes and so on, users locking together within that space, then that's planning, and maybe that's actually what you should be doing. And good news is it's a lot less technical. So if you're not too confident in your numbers or whatever, your planning is more qualitative. It's more about understanding use and perception and things like that. Work on that through planning.
All right. You've been giving us a really nice, thorough overview of what it is that you do. Could you give me a sort of an overview of what something looks like from beginning to end in terms of a project and how you move through that?
You mean like a full development project?
Yeah. So at what point do you come in, and then how does your role progress through that, through the phase of a project?
Like just say something like somebody wants to build a mid-rise suburban apartment block, 6 stories, like, for downsizing boomers or whatever. There's plenty of those kinds of products around. So a developer wants to build something like that, and they want to do it in a local council's area. The main thing is when you're putting up a building like that, a residential building, you're primarily dealing with the local council. So what happens is the local council will have prepared a planning scheme which sets out a vision for their area and various urban centres or population centres within it. And that vision or plan will have a variety of different elements to it. Things around livability or density of housing or transport connectivity or public realm, commercial activities, all sorts of things, right? So, and from that, then they'll zone parts of their functional area. This this is an area where you can have light industrial uses, and over here you can have a restaurant, and over there you must have houses separated from all of this so that there's no noise and fumes, coming from into the other and things like that. So if you're a developer, you want to build something like a mid-rise apartment tower, you have a look at the planning scheme. You see whether that council has any policies around density or suburban densification. Great, they do. That bodes well for us at a kind of a high level. Okay, let's have a look at this street. What's the zoning on the street? The zoning is residential density uplift zoning, which means that they're happy to increase densities. That's great. That also bodes well for us. Next question is how high they'll let us go, how many units we'll have to have, or how many units they'll allow us have, what they'll insist on around parking and access and things like that. So at that point, you might, as a developer, let's say, instruct your planner or your architect to do like a kind of a rough sketch plan of what you might have in mind for there. It won't be forensic, it won't be done to construction detail, but it'll be a site vision, let's say, with some treatment and discussion around those key issues around connecting to stormwater, access, lighting, meeting density goals. And also, you'll be stressing the value of what you're adding to the community, right? So you'll be stressing that you're providing units that will relieve housing pressure. You're looking to provide density that will increase critical mass for public transport demand. You're going to be adding more units and a higher height profile, which means you're going to have more passive surveillance on the street. So people will be looking out on the street. So there's less chance of incidental crime because the average criminal will think you'll feel they're being looked at, or all these kinds of things, right? And so you go to the council, you can request, if you're big enough, if the development's going to be big enough, you can request what's known as a pre-planning consultation. So you roll in there with your ideas and you meet a couple of planners and you hash it out for an hour or two, and they give you an indicative set of instructions. Yeah, we like this, but you're not getting 7 stories. It's only going to be 6. And, you got to do 2 underground levels of car parking. You can't get away with 1 because we have, blah, 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 right? Et cetera, et cetera. So if you can work within that, come back to us with detailed plans, and chances are it'll slide right through the system, no problem. And that's kind of how it goes. Where it's easier is like things like you want to make some minor alterations to your house, or maybe put a granny flat out the back or something like that, or put up a carport. Most of that is called code accessible. It doesn't require any public consultation. Generally, the council just automatically approves it because it's too low level to get upset about. And then the further end of the complexity stream, or the complexity spectrum, let's say, is something like right now where they're trying to develop an Olympic stadium in Victoria Park in Brisbane, where you're looking at not an empty, but you're looking at a huge greenfield site and saying, okay, we need to build something on here that's the size of the MCG in Melbourne, and we need to be able to get everybody on and off the site without there being chaos. We need to minimize disruption to the natural environment. We need to ensure that we're not interfering with cultural heritage. So you're starting with like an unbelievably complex set of issues there, which is why it's taking so long. And they only just announced today that they actually have a plan, which means something that they might actually try and build. So that's a much more complicated thing. And, so like where you go with any or all of that, depending on the scale of your development, is your the level of interaction you need to have with planners, maybe zero, it may be relatively minimal and just undertaken to ensure that everybody gets a good outcome and doesn't unnecessarily get on the wrong side of each other. Or it might be really intricate, where you actually have planners working for you. Your big developers like Meriton, for example, either have them on staff or on annual retainers. And so they're constantly kind of going up against the government planning approvers in this sort of a tussle, so that's basically the business of it. But generally, Australian governments want to say yes to development, not no. So as long as you're not really you're not really trying to push something that's way outside the norm or go way beyond the rules, or, you're not trying to be an unreasonable pain, they usually will play ball with you, especially with residential.
Okay. Is there a scope whereby, as a planner, say a council is going to actually do an entire new suburb, and as a planner, would you ever be sitting down as part of that council, as opposed to an individual development or something, and saying, right, here's a whole new suburb, factor in everything that suburb needs, from everything where are the roads, where the houses go, like all those things you mentioned, but transport and different types of living, different types of commercial and retail. And does that kind of, is that where an urban planner would sit there, or is that sort of another adjacent type of role that does that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, you would find urban planners in there. I mean, generally suburbs are developed in one of two ways. Like one way that suburbs are developed is that like the local council, for example, will state government and local councils together potentially will zone an area for residential, or an area that's already got a residential zone and um gets opened up for development. So there's two things that can happen. One is that the council will do some light touch development. They'll put down some roads and things like that. They'll put down a street pattern. They'll put in a bit of lighting and stuff like that, some basic servicing, make sure there's some general stormwater on site that can be upgraded, connected to sewage, all that kind of stuff. And then they'll just sort of allow the blocks to be sold off and developed, and they'll come in subsequently along the way and plant street trees and things like that. That's one way. That's the more traditional way of doing things. That's most of Australia through the 20th century, at least. In the 21st century, what's happening more and more is a thing called master planning, which is where a big development company like Lend-Lease or one of the big players will take ownership of a large block of land, like say, for example, North Lake. And what happens there is the developer says, look, we're happy to create a full suburban vision here, a master plan for a fully integrated suburb. We're going to not just provide housing, we're going to make sure the schools go in at the same time, that the community facilities go in at the same time, so that when people move here, there's a Jets Fitness that they can go to, there's a Domino's Pizza that's already open, so they're not stuck out here in isolated housing suburbia with no services. And so if we're going to do that, much like you would design, say, a theme park, you do it all on the page before you break ground.
Yep.
And in that case, their planners and the council planners and everybody else will be working together potentially for years to come to an agreeable master plan. And then that just assures that by the time you actually have to formally move through the planning stages, everybody's already sort of on board with the vision anyhow, and it's an integrated vision, and there's already been cost sharing and stuff like that. So it goes one of two ways.
That's a really in-depth explanation, because that even was something I didn't know. So you've talked about how planning is changing in that type of way, in terms of, rather than just, doing it old school, we're looking at how do we design an entire satellite city from scratch with, one major conglomerate or something. But the profession itself, is that being affected by AI in any way? I know it tends to be one of the professions that is more future-proof. Is there something that people from now would need to be on top of or aware of? These are the changes that might come with that sort of shift? Or is it going to stay fairly stable, do you think?
Yeah, to go back to what I was saying earlier, planning is relatively AI proof. There are parts of it that are starting to be AI enhanced, let's say, right? And, from a personal perspective, I could tell you that AI is getting surprisingly sophisticated at answering complex planning questions, right? But AI is not a planner any more than it's a financial advisor or a lawyer. At the end of the day, you still need proper representation. So as a client, it can help you understand a bit more about your circumstances, but you will still need a planner, or you will still need permission from a planner. Now, if you are a planner, say in a local council, a lot of what you're doing is development approval, or let's say a lot of what a lot of planners do is development approval, which is like those applications come in to build a carport or a house or a block of apartments or whatever the case may be. And you're just going through that. Is it code accessible, or is it impact accessible? Can we just give a straight permission for it, or does it need to go to public consultation and we have submissions on it and a deeper look at it? And so there's a certain amount of kind of like when an application comes in, there's a bunch of box ticking that goes on to sort of like code it, if you like. And you can make some low level decisions based around that. And some decisions are almost automatic based on that information. AI can help with that. And I would say over time, some planning departments will start to investigate or activate, kind of this bespoke AI programs or GPTs that are good at this or programmed to do this on the basis that it might reduce their labor force demand for development approval, which is always a kind of one of the bigger areas in planning where people work. So, I mean, if you could get your team down from 5 to 4, that would be a saving. But it's not going from 5 to 0. And again, a lot of the strategic planning just can't happen with AI. It's not capable of understanding the experience of being in the space, as distinct from looking at it on maps and reading about it on Reddit or whatever the case may be.
Yep.
So there's a low level of AI potential, or a low level for AI to significantly interrupt things like strategic planning. And the other thing that AI cannot do is it can't do site surveys and it can't talk to people, and therefore it can't facilitate public consultation or stakeholder engagement or any of the stuff that's really important nowadays around social planning. Um, about communities and who they are and what they want and what age they are and what health they're in, and all those kinds of questions are important for space planning now. And so a lot of planning and is around actually engaging with people and talking to them and trying to find out what it is that they feel they need or want in their lives that can be done and achieved through planning. And so again, AI is no good at that. So there's a lot that can't be done by AI, but there's a few of the more tiresome tasks that could probably be made a bit more efficient.
Sure. I'm really excited to hear that because um I mean, I have over 40 career clusters that I want to try and, get onto this podcast. But I very specifically want to highlight those ones that are going to be robust in the future as AI encroaches in more and more. So I love to hear that. Let's switch angles now and start to look at maybe the challenges of this role. Could you tell me, is what sort of point or where might people get stuck in their careers in urban planning? Is there anything that might start to wear people down?
Yes, like any career. I mean, let's be realistic. The split basically is about 25% go private sector. Sorry, 25% go private sector and about 75% go public sector.
Mhm.
And by public sector, I mean state government agency, or local council. Maybe a few of them find their way to a federal department or something like that.
Mhm.
And then the 25% that go private either go into planning consultancies, or they join big development companies, or they go and work for somebody like West Farmers or Aldi, and they do like retail planning strategically or something like that, right? So those are the kind of so let's just say that the majority of planners go and work in government. They're well compensated, they're well looked after, they mostly work indoors in air conditioning, they're not physically stressed, they're not subject to the weather, but they are subject to bureaucracy and slow decision making and layers of compliance and a kind of a reduction in the individual, the machinery of government. Now that is going to wear some people out. So I would say that is something of a hazard. The other thing is like the kind of question of transferability between the two sides. Students often ask me about this, like, what do you think is better? Like, I don't really want to work in government forever, but I recognize that if you're going to have a broad-based career, having government experience is important. So what's the way to go? And I usually say to them that I think it's probably better to go government first. And when you know how government works and views planning situations and development applications, you have more value in the private sector. Like, some people love working for government because it's relatively predictable. They can figure out what they're there to do. They have career advancement opportunities. They're well looked after with things like leave. They get decent salaries and stuff like that. But there's also other limitations that come with it. You're not out on site nearly as much. You don't get to travel much. Anything, nothing gets your name on it. Like, you're just part of the team, part of the machine. If you go private sector, there's more chance that you might be involved in more exciting projects. Potentially, you're working more with proponents and big developers. You're probably doing more problem solving than compliance, um, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the private sector is entirely reliant on the development sector. If the development sector gets slow, the private sector slows way down. So I would say for people that are happy with government and know what they're getting into, they'll be fine. For people that may not last forever in an environment like that, it's probably good to have a career plan about what you would do if you either were sick of working in that type of an environment or wanted to leverage that for something else.
Yeah.
Like, because otherwise you'll get kind of stuck, you
Yeah.
know.
And people do
Um,
all the time. And it doesn't matter what
yeah.
you do.
The other thing that I always kind of stress to students is like just really, like, even though it may not be relevant right now, it'll be relevant faster than you realize potentially. And that's things like family life and lifestyle and
Yeah. So
commuting
it's
times. And
predictable and it's safe and as safe as any job can be, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot
yeah,
of
and
predictability in it, in those types of things.
and at a certain life stage, that can be very attractive for people, when they have young kids and things like that. It's it's more, understanding, whereas in the private sector is probably less understanding of that. It's like, look, the client needs you at Mount Isa in the morning, you're going. you know.
Absolutely.
Um, I often tell people, think about where you like, are you super career ambitious and just like your career is all you're ever going to care about? Um, or like what are you thinking of? And you'll find, that it's just as many of the guys as the girls, if you raise this, will kind of go, you know what, yeah, I
Yeah.
not thinking about it right now, but because I'm only 22 or 23, but I wouldn't necessarily be ruling out the idea of a family. I'd like that idea. And it's kind of like, well, sure, you can certainly keep that door open, but maybe now for the next 5 or 10 years is the time to do all the wild kind of travel
Oh,
and if you want to go and work as a planner in London, now's the time to do it, not when you're 35.
yeah. On the flip side of that, then, who's going to really thrive in this role? What kind of attributes and other skills? Obviously, communication is a big one, but are there any key skills or attributes that are really going to be meaningful in this space that are going to really see people get ahead?
Here's where it gets really interesting because planning is the only field of study and professional industry that I'm aware of that doesn't have to make any special effort to attract a more or less 50-50 split, right? So we get about half of our students are female, half are male, and you'll see the same thing in the workplace. It doesn't, there's no social engineering required there. There's never been a kind of, sort of like girls in STEM level campaign for girls in planning. They just come. Um, and the reason for that is those who do take the time to look at the industry will see that there are quite a number of different foci in planning or activities. Like you can be very logical, very numbers driven, very quantitative, and like big spreadsheets and go into transport planning and be extremely happy. You can be a real people person who's warm, who does well with groups, who's kind of compassionate and considerate about the needs of people, um, and particularly some of those needs that are less widely recognized, like with disabilities or the needs of parents with kids or whatever. And you could be really great at stakeholder consultation and social planning. And so we'll get like in those really technical roles, as a rule, we'll find more of the guys, and in the kind of more social roles, we'll find more of the girls. And then the rest of it allows opportunities to do sort of both or to change over time, right? So it what we find is students come into planning, then they decide over a year or two what bit of planning they really like, and then they start to lean into that and develop the skills that are best appropriate to that. Um, and that's not to say that, I mean, I'm talking in general terms where some of them go, but most of them still go up the middle road, and just have a kind of a broad-based set of planning skills, which are quantitative, qualitative, communicative, etc. And they go into all kinds of roles. But it does have that distribution. So you will get the very, as I say, analytical people going in one direction, and the very kind of as a people-based people going in some other directions, and everything in between.
Great. That's really nice to hear because I, you don't often see that, especially if you look in the broader sphere of the world that you exist in. If we look at construction and development and all those types of things, I'm glad to see that there's a little bit of a scope there for everybody. If you get into it and suddenly decide, oh, I really lean this way, well, you know what? There's still a path for you. That doesn't discount you just because you're not, like you said, that numbers driven person or whatever. That really pleases me. I am conscious of your time, so I'm just trying to quickly scan through my questions and go over what you've already covered, which has been a lot. I like to just zip it and just let somebody talk. Get a lot of good information that way. I know I just talked about who's going to do well here, but who's going to thrive long term? Who's really going to go the distance in this role? Do you think? Is there anything special needed there? And also, what becomes really rewarding in this role once you've been in it, or only after you've been in it for quite a while? Is there anything?
Yeah, I'll just sort of address them these things separately, if I may. I mean, the way that people go forward, I think, is primarily through being in the network. So
Mhm.
what happens is, because it's not a huge industry, the people who are involved know each other, and it stratifies, right? So you'll have a ton of graduates who know each other because they not just graduated at the same time, they also went to all of the Planning Institute Young Planners events for the last 2 or 3 years. So you have groups entering the field every couple of years who know each other, like the 3 or 4 years that they were in university together, and then they can't, so there's sort of this turnover of groups and they move up, right? And then because it's not a huge industry, the professional development, the get-togethers, the talks, and the information sessions, they continue to happen regularly. People continue to go to them, and so the network becomes self-sustaining. And then jobs are mostly filled before they're even advertised a lot of the time. Or it's like, oh, Terry's over in ACOM right now, but word is she's not happy. If we had a talk to her, she might come over here as the principal, and like if you're good and you're active and you're around and you're ambitious, you'll find the opportunity and people will
Right.
be looking for you. If you just want to kind of like get to a cruising altitude and work for a local council on a flexi time arrangement and just keep the money coming in and the job steady, that's fine too. But
Mm.
it's a small enough industry that it's not hard to hear the opportunities or to be known to be interested in opportunities. And, really, you could probably even stay in your local area. Like most planners in Southeast Queensland don't have any real career or economic need to go elsewhere. Likewise, Sydney and Melbourne are both relatively self-sustaining also. Some people decide to go regional because they think it's a great opportunity to learn more because they'll be more on their own with less resources and a wider portfolio. And that works out great as well. We've had one of our guys who graduated here a couple of years ago. He went up to Rockhampton and became a regional planner there, won the Planning Institute Young Planner of the Year award for his work in the regions. So there's those opportunities as well. But I mean, if you want to keep going up and you're ambitious and you're known to be good, you'll keep getting opportunities in my experience. And I've been here for 16 years now looking at how it runs, and I've always seen it go that way.
Fantastic. I love to hear that kind of information. Just quickly, if anyone was later in their career and looking to perhaps consider this, are there any, obviously you've talked about things like architecture and those sort of adjacent roles, but are there any types of roles or professions that might really easily transfer in to urban planning?
I'm grateful for you that you asked this question because it did remind me, like I talked earlier about how it's normal to do an undergraduate planning degree in Australia. There are still plenty of planning postgraduate degrees that will condense the
Mhm.
teaching and content and less like again, they're 2 years instead of four, but you'll still come out accredited professionally. So
Mhm.
they're more for career changers. So if you were a career changer, say coming out of any of the built environment professions, like I'll give you one example.
Yeah.
Student of ours that graduated, I think he graduated in 2024, probably end of
Mhm.
24. Um, he came to us at 25, fully qualified electrician, working full time. And he just said, look, I don't want to do this long term because my body and physical health is worth more to me than this. And I've seen a vision of my future already, and I don't want to be, in permanent pain and crawling around in attic cavities at 55 or anything. He said, so I don't want to. So I'm gonna, so he did that. I did something similar to that. So
Mm.
if you're coming out of a career where you have some alignment with the idea of planning, at least, or maybe you're familiar with it, but you do the master's degree as a way of kind of retooling your career and changing direction and putting you back onto a pathway. And even though you might come out of a master's and be sort of in a low level planning role or graduate role or something, graduate role, you'll probably still be on more money than you were beforehand. That's the way to do it if you're a career changer, is do a 2 year master's like we have at Griffith.
Do you have any general advice for young people who would be considering this role today?
My advice to anyone considering a role is, could you still imagine yourself happily, or at least vision yourself happily doing it in 10 or 15 or 20 years? Is there enough in it that if you put in the 2 or 3 or 4 years now, that you think you'll still want to be doing this in the future, and that you think it will in some way suit or fit in with the life that you've envisioned for yourself? I mean, that's functionally the question.
I really like that because I ask this question of people all the time whenever I'm out and about and all my networking. And that seems like such an obvious answer, but nobody's ever given me that before. It's more of
Well,
a, oh, if you want to do this, do that. But nobody actually says, look at this, think about how it's going to project over your life. Can you foresee yourself doing this over and over and over? And seems pretty logical, but so thanks for the reminder. We
what's
sometimes just miss
well,
it.
I mean, I guess we don't always think of it like that, but it's like you're investing a
Yeah, it's
huge
a really
amount into
important
this. You're
point.
you're investing your time, you're taking on debt, you're investing opportunities where you could be earning salary. There's massive opportunity cost for doing any course of study, any type of qualification, anything at all. So it's a return on investment, and
Yep.
return on investment is not just salary, it's also lifestyle,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know.
And that's a big one too. A lot of people, I see that in my work, people tend to be drawn earlier by status or finance or whatever, and they don't really give enough thought to the longer term. How does this affect my life if I want to have a family later, or if I need to move, or where do I need to be, just to sustain that career? All right, let's get on to the fun stuff. My rapid fire questions, and then I can let you get on with your day. What is the best career advice that you ignored at first, but later realized was right?
That having a steady work situation was an enormous benefit.
Mhm,
Like I remember my dad saying that, and because my dad was a doctor, GP, so he had a very successful practice and things like that. But ultimately, it all came down to him being there.
mhm,
Um, and he was saying to me, I wish I'd have become a hospital consultant because then I'd just be on a big salary, and if I didn't go to work, it didn't matter. There's so much to be said for that.
mhm.
And at the time, my attitude, because this was many years ago, was like, well, like then they own you, and blah 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 blah. But what he really meant was like if you want to put like some kind of a solid foundation underneath your life for enough for long enough to get your life going, like self-actualization,
Mhm.
it's better to have a steady gig at least for some of your life, especially in your early career. I mean, started a PhD, moved to Australia, made the decision to move to Australia on the day of my 30th birthday, came over here, started a PhD, finished that when I was 33. And only then did I start earning proper money and being in full-time work. And so now I was 10 years beyond where I should have been trying to catch up. And luckily then I was able to sustain steady work and still am. I'm in a full-time job. So that was what he meant was like, that will rack up over time and it just makes your life more stable. You're not always in a kind of a cash flow crisis and things like that. It wasn't that he was telling me to do boring work. He was just giving me functional advice. I just wasn't hearing it like that.
Well, we're young. We don't want to hear that when we're young, do we?
No, 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 we don't. We don't. We don't.
Uh,
And it sounds really dull and you think you're going to be the exception to that rule.
this is not necessarily career related, but I like to ask it because they often tie in, and it might be part of that answer you've just given. If you were to start over again tomorrow, what would you focus on first?
I think I'd be looking much more closely. I mean, if we're just assuming, say, that if we back in time and I'm starting to kind of come into thinking about going to like uni or something like that,
Mhm.
is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, like the fundamental life decisions at 18. I think I'd have probably been a bit smarter about trying to come up with a vision for what came after. I had one very clear option at the time, because I spent a lot of my teenage years working in high-end hotels, doing bar work and accommodation services and restaurant work and guest services and stuff like that. So I was quite heavily persuaded to look at hotel management as a career, and I would have been very good at it. And I applied to a very prestigious hotel management college in Europe, and I got in. And I was suddenly faced with this situation where my entire future was I had no decision making in my future anymore. Like I was going to leave private school and go back to private school and continue to wear a blazer and continue to be managed 24 hours a day. And I was going to leave there after 4 years and go and work in this hotel for 6 months and that hotel for 6. And that was my life. And I thought, oh God, I don't really like the look of that. So I backed way off of it and I told my parents I didn't want to do it. And I'm not sure I've ever really been forgiven for that. Um, and then I drifted into just, as I say, not drifted, but I went into a degree, like I described earlier, economics and sociology, but I had no vision then for afterwards. So I had a great time at university and then I was lost and forlorn as soon as I finished there. But yeah, so I think if I was to go back, I just had a bit of a better vision about like what I'm doing in university or the decisions that I make for that period need to be leading to somewhere. I mean, it doesn't need to be like the most constrained and difficult and managed road in the world, but I kind of chose the Wild West instead.
And look, and that's what career development is all about. It's being really self-aware and understanding beyond what do I think I might like as a job, but what brings fulfillment to you? Where's your purpose? What are your values? What motivates you? There's so many more factors in it that we just as young people we don't think about, and nobody teaches us that. So, it's all right. Last question.
No,
It might be a bit of an overlap, but if you were giving advice to your 18-year-old self today, and this is not even related to career, but what would you tell them to try sooner?
it's probably impractical advice for the modern generation, but have your own children in your 20s because you'll wait till your 30s like they all do, like I did. And then you realize in your 30s, you don't have half the energy for this that you once had. But that's probably not practical because a lot of them won't have children anyway. They don't seem to rate that as a life ambition. I suppose it's like it's get the fun stuff out of the way, right? Because if you don't get the fun stuff out of the way up front, and you're like, oh, I'm going to do my Kentucky tour, right? Just for right, but I'm not doing it till I'm 23. No, do it now because then you'll be interrupting more to do it, and it'll be harder to return from it. Get that stuff out of your system if you must early, rather than I'll go to university for 4 years, then I'll do it, then I'll come back and try and get a job. It's almost like just take the gap year up front. Or if you ever think you'll take a gap year, take it sooner rather than later. Because the further you go into something, the harder it gets then to leave it at all, or the more you stand to lose a few.
Absolutely. This has been such an interesting and lovely in-depth conversation with you today, Tony. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and I really appreciate your time. And I'm sure that my listeners are going to get an absolute wealth of information and insight from what you've told us today. I could sit here and talk all day, so but you're a busy man.
My pleasure. Thank you, Terry.
Before we finish up today, here are 3 key takeaways from my conversation with Dr. Tony Matthews. Firstly, urban planning is far more strategic than people think. It's not just approving buildings. It is about shaping how cities function, balancing housing, transport, environment, and community needs over time. Much of the work involves translating big picture visions into practical decisions on the ground. If you think this job is admin or compliance, you will definitely underestimate both the impact and the skill required. Secondly, communication is a core skill that drives success in planning. The ability to explain complex ideas simply, write clearly, and engage with different stakeholders determines how effective you are. Technical knowledge matters, but it is useless if you cannot translate it. This is not a quiet technical job. Your impact depends on how well people understand and accept your ideas. And finally, urban planning offers strong job security and future relevance. There is a persistent shortage of planners, high demand across government and private sectors, and limited risk from AI due to the human and strategic nature of the work. This is a rare combination of meaningful work and long-term career stability. If you enjoyed my chat with Dr. Matthews today and would like to see more of this type of content, be sure to like and subscribe. And also share this with somebody who you think might be interested in this information. If there's a role that you're interested in, please leave a comment below and I'll be sure to see if I can turn that into a future episode for you. Thanks for joining me today on Work Uncovered. And remember, you can't be what you can't see. So always be curious.